Hello and welcome back to Palaeocast. My name is Dave Marshall and you're listening to episode 148 on Palaeoart in popular culture. This is the first part in a 3-part episode that pretty much covers the whole history of dinosaurs in pop culture, from sculptures and mounted skeletons to paintings, animations, documentaries and film. It's also our first ever guest interview and features PhD student Vicky Coules being interviewed by Dr Suresh Singh, both of the University of Bristol. We have a really great platform here at Palaeocast to share all sorts of paleontological multimedia. And if, like Suresh, you know of a great paleontological story that needs telling, then please do get in touch. We've got the podcast, we've got a blog, we've got a gaming channel on YouTube, or you could simply just email info@palaeocast.com with a request or recommendation. And in the name of sharing our platform with others, it's time for another Paleo podcast plug.
Hi there, I'm Travis Holland, and thanks to Palaeocast, I'm here to tell you about my podcast, Fossils and Fiction. I'm a media researcher with a lifelong interest in dinosaurs, and I'm making this podcast as part of my work at Charles Sturt University. I'm using it as a way to ask questions of experts in the field. You'll hear me speak to paleontologists, authors, museum workers, PhD students, and even a few media types like myself, about a huge range of topics related to paleontology and particularly dinosaurs. Find Fossils and Fiction on your favourite podcast platforms, social media, or the website fossilsfiction.co. And thanks to Palaeocast for giving me this space.
So, Fossils and Fiction sounds incredibly relevant to this episode's topic, so if you find yourself wanting to learn more between now and parts 2 and 3, then please do check it out. Unfortunately, this episode wasn't recorded with any of this fancy studio equipment, so it does start off a little rough, but soon smooths out after about 10 minutes or so please do stick with it. In other news, I've started collecting prizes for a new Palaeocast art competition, and I'll be looking to expand our team into the new year, so please keep an eye out for notifications about both of these things. As always, images that accompany this episode are available on our website, and we would love some love on social media, so please give this episode a boost wherever you can. Merry Christmas to all of you who celebrate it, and I hope you enjoyed part 1 of this fascinating interview.
Hello, I'm Dr Suresh Singh, and I'll be your host for this episode of Palaeocast. And today I'm joined by Vicky Coules from the University of Bristol in the UK, who spent the last few years doing a PhD on the links between art and paleontology through history. We'll be discussing some of her research and talking about topics such as the origins of dinomania, why do people get so worked up about feathered dinosaurs, how did the filmmakers of Jurassic Park know T-Rex better than the paleontologists of the day, and also, what's the link between American farmers, Al Capone, and the cartoon dinosaurs in Disney's Fantasia? It promises to be a most interesting and colourful episode. I'd expect nothing less when talking Palaeoart. So Vicky, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. We've already had a few chats in the office about your work, but please let me begin today by asking you, what exactly led you to do a PhD on this subject?
Well, it's complicated really, but firstly, just dinosaurs are fairly cool, so that goes without saying.
Definitely.
Absolutely. And I think there are several reasons. One of them is I've always been interested in public engagement with science, and Darren Nash puts it very well when he says dinosaurs are ambassadors for science. And we see how a public who wouldn't normally be interested in science and even dismiss it, as soon as there's a new dinosaur story, I could include the fact there was one this morning, it appears on the national news. It's discussed on national radio and so on. And the public seem fascinated by them. And for me, it's a way of almost sneaking some science in without them realising it. I'm interested in visual culture and art history. I have a master's in art history. And I just started to look around as to what was written or studied about the use of dinosaurs in images. Now, paleontology as a science is one of the very few sciences that's totally dependent on artists, whether the scientists would agree or not. But basically, it's artists who can create the things that paleontologists are studying. And I think it was important for somebody to look at that relationship from the art history and visual culture angle and look at perhaps the background, the validity of some of those images and animations, and have a look and see what was actually in those images that goes beyond the simple view of, oh, we're just illustrating a prehistoric creature.
Because I was going to say that artists don't exist in a vacuum. So there's going to be loads of things influencing them, as well as, of course, the science, or in some cases, perhaps they disregard the science entirely. But there would have been, I imagine, a lot of different sort of influences on these artists through time.
Exactly, and that's something I'm looking at in depth. So my research could cover anything from politics, finance, economics, who's paying for these expeditions and displays and why, the cultural background, the artist's training and their own interests. So it can get very complicated very quickly.
I can imagine.
And I'm concentrating, for my thesis, I'm concentrating on late 19th century and early 20th century America, simply because that's really where what we're calling dinomania started. So I'm looking at what happened, why we think it happened, and where it developed. So although I'm interested in the whole subject, and our discussion here will be quite broad-ranging, my actual dissertation will concentrate on that period. So that's where a lot of my research has actually happened.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, it sounds like you're taking a tangled web and sort of trying to get at the all the different nodes of it and sort of follow the clues. It's quite the detective story.
Oh, very much. And I mean, I have an advantage working now where I can work on fast broadband and access resources from all over the world. So I have, for example, been able to trawl through things like the New York Times of the 19th century and so on, and have begun to find reports and articles from there that are very, very relevant to what we're looking at. A researcher maybe working even 20 years ago wouldn't have had that luxury. So the time is right for me to access. I have obviously been working over the last few years and under the shadow of COVID. Ideally, I would have gone to the States and actually gone into some libraries and archives, but I have found that researchers in the States have been incredibly helpful and generous with their time and ideas and so on. So I don't think it's held me up that much.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. I mean, yeah, the last few years for, I think, most everybody has been really tough, but especially so for PhD students, I think, just especially here in the UK, given that obviously there's a whole load of issues with funding and how much time they put into their studies, and very tough time indeed. But I'm glad to hear that it hasn't slowed you down.
No, I don't think it has. I think we've got round it anyway.
Excellent. So just to go back, you mentioned dinomania a moment ago. So we're kind of in our own dinomania at the moment, are we not? In the sense that there's been a recent bonanza of paleontological media. We've got Prehistoric Planet on Apple TV, The Day the Dinosaurs Died, documentary from the BBC, and of course the finale of the Jurassic World movie trilogy, Jurassic World Dominion. So we're not talking about these films in a moment, but it's fair to say that dinosaurs have loomed large in people's imagination ever since we've known about them.
Well, almost since we've known about them. For a while, they were known, as you know, they were being initially discovered, if you like, and excavated in England a lot of the time, and with some in Europe. But it took two events, really. One was the Crystal Palace dinosaurs, where the public were suddenly able to walk around life-size models of prehistoric creatures. There are only 4 dinosaurs in that group of creatures. But that rather captivated Victorian England. The area I'm interested in is something that actually happened in America, hence my interest. And it also included it also included Benjamin Waterhouse Hawkins, who, as you all know, designed and created Crystal Palace dinosaurs. And he went to America for complicated reasons, and he was asked to put together a similar display in a museum for Central Park.
So would you say this was like the original Jurassic Park, and he was sent over, well, he went to America to sort of set up an American version?
Yeah.
So kind of like Disneyland and Euro Disney.
Yes, I think that's a fair way of putting it. He was asked to, he was commissioned to make this display in an interior museum that they would build in Central Park. But what was interesting before we go down that route was he had to do some research because they wanted to show American prehistoric animals, not British ones. And to find out about these, one of his research trips took him to Philadelphia, to the Academy of Natural Sciences, where Joseph Leidy was the paleontologist in residence, and Edward Drinker Cope was working there. But they had the best preserved and nearly not complete, probably about 60%, nearly 60% complete skeleton in America, and that was of Hadrosaurus fulci. Now, those bones were in drawers and boxes. Hawkins wanted to make casts of them because he wanted to include them in his own display in New York. And he then, from his own pocket, and if you like, as a favour to the Academy for being so helpful, offered to mount this as an articulated skeleton of the dinosaur. And this had never been done before. We're rather surprised now. We tend to assume we'd walk into a natural history museum just about anywhere, and there we would admire a skeleton, whether it's Sue or the Diplodocus in the Natural History Museum, and so on. But this was the first time that anybody had even tried this.
So how long did it take between people sort of finding dinosaurs and then becoming known to the sort of general public, between sort of their first appearance in popular culture and them actually being mounted?
Not that long in the scale of things. I mean, they started to, early 19th century, we were beginning to see fossils being uncovered. As you know, Richard Owen named them in 1842. The Great Exhibition in Hyde Park was in 1851, and by 1854 they had moved the whole Crystal Palace to its eventual site in Sydenham in London, and that's where what they called the geological court was put together. So the Crystal Palace dinosaurs started to appear around the late 1850s. The dinosaur in America would be 1868. So it wasn't that long. So it wasn't immediate, but it was actually quite quick. But this idea of Hawkins saying, I'll mount this to look like the skeleton of a dinosaur was absolutely crucial to our understanding of, and became known as dinomania.
Dinosaurs got this sort of extra appreciation from the public compared to sort of the Ice Age mega beasts, the mammoths and whatnot that had been discovered beforehand. But so people have always been sort of mad about dinosaurs.
I think it kicked off really with the Philadelphia Hadrosaurus, and I think that was for two reasons. One was that Leidy, with some input from Cope, had worked out that given the proportion of the skeleton that it had to be bipedal. And those of you familiar with the Crystal Palace dinosaurs will know that they were all fairly chunky quadrupeds.
Sort of giant lizards.
Like giant lizards, quite low slung. So the first thing was that it was bipedal, and Hawkins mounted it as such. You look at the original photographs of the mount, and it actually looks like it's holding a branch, and that branch is an armature to take the weight of the figure of the skeleton. And the other reason was its size. I mean, it was about 15 feet tall. There's a famous photograph that was reproduced and as a photograph and as illustrations, and we're fairly sure it is Hawkins himself standing next to this. And it's about 2.5 times the height of a man. So even if you had seen the skeleton of something like a mammoth, to see a bipedal creature this big I think would have been quite a surprise. And it really, I think that's one of the reasons that the enthusiasm sort of took off, certainly in America.
Was it just this whole thing of bigger is better?
And I think bigger was unusual. I mean, if you've gone to the zoo, you're not going to see anything much bigger than, say, an elephant. The Ice Age fauna wasn't massively big in comparison, but to see this creature that was supposed to have lived in New Jersey be that big, I think was a source of fascination. And to see a creature that big, essentially what we call now the kangaroo stance, but was standing on its back legs with its forelegs holding this armature branch, and it's sort of resting in this 3-point stance that we've seen so many times, more recently with T-Rex and so on, where it's resting on the tail and balancing. And I think that was just such a surprise to the public that the enthusiasm for these creatures was just took off.
It was just something completely alien to them.
Yes, something completely different. And to have it that big, standing bipedally as well. I think had it been quadrupedal, it would have been interesting, but I think that, of course, gave it more height because it was standing up.
So did the Crystal Palace dinosaurs, they were, of course, quadrupedal?
Yes.
But they didn't they attracted a lot of attention, but would you say the levels of interest or mania were equivalent, or was it the fact that this New Jersey Hadrosaur was bipedal and it had that extra height, that extra size, that really gave it, a big place in pop culture at the time?
I think that's one of the reasons. I think another reason is that after the Crystal Palace dinosaurs, once the initial enthusiasm had worn off, the sort of visitor numbers trailed rather, there wasn't really much, certainly in the UK, to follow that through. But we might touch again on this later, but what happened in Philadelphia attracted the attention, shall we say, of the other museums. And when you look at a museum like the American Museum of Natural History, once Henry Osborn took over, the Smithsonian in Washington, they realised that this was an income generator. So they could charge people to come in and see dinosaurs, and people would pay, and of course the museum gained. So there was more of an interest, if you like, in finding and presenting and displaying these dinosaurs, simply from the pragmatic point of view that it was going to make money.
So am I right in thinking that before this point, museums hadn't charged people for entry?
As far as I know, I would need to check in detail, but as far as I know, they were considered as, sometimes they weren't even what we would consider open to the public. They existed for scholars to go along. So if you were interested in paleontology, you would go along, and somebody, rather like Hawkins did for his research, they would get the bones out of the drawer or the box and you'd examine them. So it was a case of at that stage, so we're looking at the late 1860s, the museums didn't exist really in the form that we know them now. And that's a hugely fascinating and separate, that the history of museums and museology is a huge area in history anyway.
Indeed. Yeah, I'm just curious. 'Cause, yeah, when you think of these sort of museums, they have a long history dating back, but it seems like they didn't really start becoming popular public attractions, as it were, until the discovery of dinosaurs.
Partly the discovery of dinosaurs. The other thing that was happening, and it happened more in America than here, was that the great and good, if you like, of America were beginning to think that there was this motivation to entertain and educate the working classes. And they felt that there was a whole movement that started, I would need to check, but I'm fairly sure it started in America, of this idea of visual education. The theory was that you learned more by looking at an image or an object than you did by reading the label. And that was another thing that drove the museums to think very hard about how they presented their displays, because they felt they were doing a great good for the public.
Was that whole idea of the public good?
Very much so. And the people with the money, the great philanthropists, saw their role as putting some of their wealth back into the population, if you like, by doing this sort of thing. And we have JP Morgan funding the AMNH. We have Carnegie, of course, with his own museum in Pittsburgh, and putting money into public services, libraries and the like. And it was the thing to do, to be seen, to sort of be seen as good guys, even though they were responsible for the creation of wealth and, you know, the working conditions of labourers.
So kind of like these titans of industry and capitalism sort of wanted to show that they were businessmen with a heart.
Absolutely,
yeah.
Yes.
So would it also be fair to say that this was kind of a bit of a contest between them, like who could get the best dinosaur?
Absolutely, very much so.
My museum is better than your museum.
My dinosaur is better than yours. There is a story, it might be apocryphal, but there was a huge rivalry between Andrew Carnegie, JP Morgan, John Rockefeller. And the story is that the AMNH got hold of, they called their Brontosaurus. It went on public display in 1905. We'll meet this Brontosaurus again later. Apparently, Carnegie was sitting in Pittsburgh having his cup of coffee and cigar over his breakfast and looked at the newspaper and saw the report of this great opening of this fantastically large dinosaur and went spare and didn't like the fact that he didn't have the biggest and best. So he tried to buy it and they were having none of it. And then he wrote a very large check for one of his members of his museum to go and excavate a dinosaur that big, and they found the Diplodocus. And so this rivalry was spurring this on, and the dinosaur, to some extent, became a symbol of this great sort of wealth and capitalism and so on that was happening in America at the end of the 19th century.
So is that kind of tied to... Is that maybe tied to oil, perhaps? Because, you know, you think like things like, is it Texaco with the dinosaur label brand, and this whole idea of these giants coming from the ground.
Yes.
Sort of, monumental power that they seem, that we imbued them with because they're just so big.
It was Sinclair, but yes, their logo was a green sauropod. And very much so, they were selling it on this idea of... The other issue, which gets complicated, as I said, things do, is that, of course, they knew the dinosaurs had gone extinct. They didn't know why, and they didn't know exactly when. But there was an interesting conflict between considering the dinosaur as this great symbol of power and also considering it as this incredibly stupid animal that was too stupid to survive. But the Sinclair Oil Company for a very long time was used the dinosaur as their logo and played on the idea that the dinosaur, they thought that the oil and so on, rather than being, with coal, for example, it's plant matter, but they actually thought that they were excavating dead dinosaur.
So they thought that oil was literally, they were burning dinosaurs.
I'd need to do a bit more research on this myself because Sinclair comes on a little bit later than my time, but it was certainly a very complex area of what the dinosaur symbolised and the fact that these titans of industry, which you rightly call them, were beginning to use them as almost like an icon of that wealth, capitalism, manifest destiny and so on of America.
Was it perhaps also quite big in American, sort of the American psyche, because American dinosaurs were coming out, thick and fast, and they were so much bigger than pretty much anything that had been seen in Europe, apart from maybe a few of the iguanodontians over on the continent. But America had the big dinosaurs, which pretty much at that point weren't found elsewhere.
Definitely, there was very much a feeling that at last, as Cope and Marsh as well were going out and finding in the Midwest these fossils, these iconic dinosaurs as we think of them now, they were bigger, they were more dramatic. If you think about something like a Stegosaurus, there'd been nothing like this in Europe. And there had been this rivalry which was coming out whereby Europe was the old and best and most refined and so on. And the fact that suddenly America had these dinosaurs that were bigger, definitely, were more unusual, unexpected, if you like, in terms of what they look like, that it was, I would say it's a good way of going sort of Yabu sucks to Europe, because there was no way that anything in Europe, there wasn't much more being discovered in Europe at the time. Whereas suddenly in 1870s onwards, these dinosaurs were being excavated in America by Americans and being mounted, and they were dramatically different from anything that Europe could compete with.
I could see why the Americans would at the time would like that. Because you're right. I think back then there was a very much a sort of view of the European, like you said, the Europeans would be kind of saw themselves as being more cultured, perhaps.
Yes.
And there's a bit of snobbery
towards
definitely. The Americans, which is maybe a bit still there today to an extent in some circles.
Yes, but certainly in the arts, for example, that was very much the case for quite a long time, whereby if you wanted to collect paintings, you went to Europe and bought European old masters. It was very unusual to buy, for example, a painting from an American painter. In terms of collecting its value, you might like the painting, put it on your wall, but in terms of collecting for its intrinsic value, that was very much the case. But there was this competitiveness over the science, and the sense that Europeans had effectively discovered dinosaurs first, but these dinosaurs coming out of America, there was just nothing to compete with it in Europe.
Yeah. So there's quite the early history of paleomedia then. There seems to be a lot of rivalry, not just in terms of the science, but also the people behind it. So the people who were paying for these expeditions to go out and dig up dinosaurs, as well as the museums themselves. There seems to be a lot of rivalry in early paleontology.
I think that started then. I'd be surprised if there still isn't. We know that, but there was, and I think it might well be. I'm fairly sure that's what drove a lot of the moving forward, both in what we call the paleomedia and the actual science of paleontology, was this rivalry.
So, speaking of rivalries and famous rivalries in paleontology, so Cope v. Marsh, so Edward Drinker Cope and Charles Othniel Charles Marsh. Yeah. Obviously, a very famous rivalry in terms of digging up dinosaurs, but it seems like it wasn't just how many dinosaurs they found that was a source of contention between them. It's also in the portrayal of the dinosaurs that they found.
There were several reasons, actually. They had started out as friends, and they'd even travelled together and worked in Germany during the early 1860s, which was, the cynics amongst us would say that was a good way of escaping the American Civil War, which was happening then. So they weren't drafted. I mean, as I said, that's a slightly cynical take. They started as friends. For complicated reasons, and we may be able to do another session on this, they fell out. And people know of, as you rightly say, their rivalry over the fossils.
Bone wars.
The bone wars, as they became known. It got very embarrassing for everybody concerned. But having looked at this in a bit more detail, there were two other reasons that they were not going to get on. One was that they disagreed completely, because if you think Charles Darwin's book on the origin of species had been published and eventually published in America, Marsh was very much in favour of the idea of natural selection. Cope, who was religious, was less so. And Cope was continually looking for ways of explaining the evolution that they were discovering that was being evidenced by the fossils they were finding without resorting to natural selection, because of perhaps his more religious thinking. So there was immediately a disagreement there. Marsh actually corresponded with Darwin, and Darwin was very complimentary about Marsh's discoveries. There is a letter where Darwin says, it was particularly the work he did on the horse, the evolution of the horse, but Darwin was very appreciative that what Marsh was finding was giving evidence to his theory of natural selection. Cope much less so. So there was a disagreement there between the two men. So without the fossil rivalry, this wasn't going to help. Now, the other disagreement between them that I find fascinating, and I've been looking at because of the the fact that there was the portrayal of dinosaurs, a couple of things. I'm personally a practicing artist as well as an art historian and so on. And I know that I think visually. I make notes in colours. If I'm thinking about a subject that I find hard, I will doodle it, draw it, diagrams and so on, and think visually. Cope was a very, very accomplished artist. He could draw from an early age and he was encouraged to draw. Marsh, not so. Marsh never drew anything of his own. And so my thinking behind this rivalry as well is I think they would literally think differently about the world around them. I think Cope, as an artist, would think visually. He would try to picture or imagine what he was finding, his discoveries, his discovered animals. And if you look at some of his very early work, he would encourage, either draw himself and encourage the artists and illustrators working with him to put those animals within an ecology, in an environment, a landscape, if you like. Marsh, on the other hand, hated this idea. He really didn't want to represent any of these creatures as living animals. And this was another huge source of disagreement between them.
Yeah, so friends to enemies, but very different fundamentally in terms of just their overall outlook, their view of the world. But is it true to say that this division between them kind of still exists to an extent in Palaeoart, between how far you represent the animal in its in a life setting, as opposed to just the animal itself from the fossils that we know?
I think it is. I think it's still very much the case. And as we pick up, I mean, we see it with heated discussions about things like the Jurassic Park franchise and so on. There was a lovely incident. We're broadcasting from Bristol in the UK, and the other person who comes into this is Henry Fairfield Osborne, who became director of the AMNH. And he encouraged the display of dinosaurs, and he employed the painter that I'm sure you've all heard of, Charles Knight. Osborne was very keen that, partly as a way of displaying to the public, but out of his own interest, that he encouraged Knight to actually paint these animals in their whole environment as if they were living animals. And this whole dispute blew up in a meeting that actually happened here in Bristol. In 1898, a meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science, which held its meeting every year. It was an international meeting. They still have them, but in those days it was international. It would move around different cities. And in 1898, it was held in Bristol. Now, Marsh was over for that meeting. He was old then and not very well. He died the following year. Osborne came over. Osborne was doing a presentation to the geological branch about how they were presenting this material in his museum. And he brought with him 4 paintings by Knight to show the meeting. And Marsh was in the audience, and eventually, during the discussion afterwards, it was reported in the Times of England, in the discussion afterwards, it got a bit aerated, and Marsh referred to it as kindergarten science.
Wow.
And got cross. There's some other interesting correspondence. Marsh was good friends with Henry Woodward, the British geologist, and there's a correspondence where Marsh is on the boat on the way back to America, and Marsh saying, I got a bit aerated. But to be fair, I can see both sides, because Marsh's argument was that, and we've met this, and I'm sure all the paleontologists listening to this will start to grin as I explain. Marsh's argument was, if we don't know enough about them and we present them as living animals, that's how the public are going to remember them. And we might be wrong. And doesn't this all sound familiar with the good old velociraptors?
Indeed.
So I've looked at this in quite a lot of depth, and I think I'm not coming down on either side. I can see both arguments, and I can see that it comes all the way through.
So, is it fair to say that Jurassic Park kind of set the popular image for dinosaurs back in 1993, because I think for the last 30 years or so, when people think of dinosaurs, they think of the Jurassic Park dinosaurs, because that movie was, of course, a blockbuster. It was, the first time that the CGI had been used to display these animals as vibrant, dynamic, active, intelligent animals.
Palaeocast was brought to you by Dave Marshall and Liz Martin Silverstone, with contributions from Tom Fletcher, Vish Venkat, and Elsa Pancharoli. Music was composed by Patrick Kendall Smith. Palaeocast was made possible by funding from the Paleontological Society and the Paleontological Association, but the show now relies on funding from you, the listeners. So, if you've liked this episode, please consider donating, and thanks to everyone that's helped out so far. Please visit palaeocast.com for the supplementary material to this episode and for our archive of past programs, and follow us across social media platforms to get all the latest news. Finally, if you enjoy our podcast, then please explore all of our video content on YouTube and follow our other projects, the Virtual Natural History Museum and the Palaeocast Gaming Network.